Okay, so the Anti-Federalist. So basically, we've talked about the Declaration of Independence, which was written in 1776. It was signed. That was basically the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And of course, the Revolutionary War, the colonies having a revolution, breaking away from Great Britain. They won for a little bit less than 10 years. There was the Articles of Confederation, which we'll talk about. It's discussed in Chapter 2 of your textbook. That was the first form of government that they had. It was a relatively weak central government, and it didn't really work very well. So they basically got together at the Constitutional Convention, and they wrote a constitution, of course. That's why they call it the Constitutional Convention. And this was not immediately approved. It was sent out, and it had to be ratified by the states. So there was a huge national debate about whether or not to ratify this document. So there were people known as the Federalists who were in favor of the Constitution because they were in favor of creating this federal government. And there were people who were called the Anti-Federalists because they were against the Constitution. They were against the idea of this new federal government. And the Anti-Federalists were somewhat, they were not as tightly organized as the two or three authors of the Federalist Papers, who were obviously a smaller group. The Anti-Federalists, they were somewhat loosely affiliated, but they did have certain common things that they shared, and they had a certain common outlook. So, and they were important in large part because they went a long way towards forcing the adoption of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that have all sorts of protections for individual liberties, okay? What were some of their major concerns? Well, they argued for, as the slides say in the background of the Constitution slides, they argued for a small, very limited government based on common interest and a common education and virtue. So first of all, they wanted government to be small, and they wanted it to actually cover a small area of land. That's why they thought state government was better than federal government. And the reason for that wasn't just that they wanted smaller government. They thought that for self-government to work, for democracy to work, for people to actually be able to govern themselves, they needed to have a lot of things in common. They needed to understand each other, and they needed to be dealing with fairly basic sort of small town matters, things that people could understand, that were very, very direct, very concrete, that they could all understand. One of their concerns about the large federal government was that it would be too big, the things that it would be dealing with would be too remote from the daily lives of most people, and most people wouldn't be able to keep up, and they wouldn't be able to participate meaningfully because these things were so different from what they were dealing with on a daily basis, and therefore they would just stop paying attention to government. So, the Anti-Federalists thought that government should be small in the sense of being limited, not being nearly as powerful as the federal government, but they also thought it should cover small areas of land, and the people who were governing themselves, the people who were actually living under this democracy, they thought they should have a lot in common so that they can understand each other, and they should have common education and common idea about virtue. So they were actually much closer to an ancient republic than what the Federalists were proposing, which was a giant commercial republic, and we'll see this in Federalist 10. The idea is this very large republic that includes all of this territory and all of these different interests, and to some extent is animated by commercial or financial or economic interest, okay? The Anti-Federalists wanted something different, okay? So they didn't think that Republican government, Republican democracy, again, this isn't Republican in the sense of political parties today, Republican government in the sense of people governing themselves, they didn't think that it could effectively rule such a large territory, in large part because they thought that people are just too different. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, these are just very different places. People have totally different interests. What do people who are fishermen in Maine or Massachusetts or merchants in Boston, what do they have in common with dairy farmers in New Jersey? And what do dairy farmers in New Jersey have in common with cotton or peanut farmers in Georgia? These are just very different groups of people. They have totally different interests, totally different concerns. And the Anti-Federalists didn't think that you could bring them all together under one giant central government and govern them effectively. So the two main things that they were worried about is, first of all, the central government, the new federal government that would be created by the Constitution would be too powerful, and it would have to use force. The Anti-Federalists were very suspicious of the standing army that this new government wanted and would have, and they were very concerned that this new central government would basically, because there would be unrest among these large populations, that the central government would basically use this as an excuse to destroy democracy and basically become a tyranny. Their other major concern was that this would happen in a more subtle way. Again, maybe they thought, well, people maybe will end up becoming less interested in politics because, again, you're not talking about the kind of immediate things that small local and state government deal with. You're talking about these huge concerns of, tariff laws and all these other things that have nothing to do with the daily lives of most people. So people will just stop paying attention. And when that happens, the government, and they'll just become disengaged from politics. And if they're not actually participating in politics, if they're not actually paying attention to what politicians are doing, what the government is doing, and so on, and they just stop being engaged at all, then the government can slowly but surely take more and more power from them. So they were worried about that, and they were also worried that very clever but very ambitious and even tyrannical people, and they were, really a lot of personal insults towards some of the Federalists, especially James Madison, who, is now considered the sort of one of the very great founders, the architect of the Constitution, later president. At the time, he was often attacked, and people just attacked him as someone who just wanted to destroy democracy in America and become a tyrant and all these other things. The idea was these people are very clever, and they'll be able to get in, and they'll sort of either trick or dupe or else overpower the citizenry who, again, just aren't up to the challenge of trying to govern this massive territory. So again, they were worried either people would become indifferent, stop paying attention to politics, and you would get tyranny that way, or you would just get brutal repression because this federal government would have to do that to keep order in this large territory with all these different groups. No one is going to feel a very strong sense of loyalty to a federal government, they thought, because it's going to be so far removed from them. Or else, again, somebody like Madison will get in there and will basically trick people into giving him too much power, and then he'll take over as a tyrant or a despot. Okay, and so some of the other major concerns, they wanted to preserve things like freedom of the press and trial by jury. There were no explicit guarantees of these freedoms in the Constitution as it was originally written. There is now, because of the Bill of Rights, the 10 amendments that were added. The First Amendment obviously guarantees freedom of the press. Later amendments have all sorts of guarantees for the rights of criminals, that people who have been accused of crimes, defendants in the criminal justice system, things like trial by jury, the right to a trial by jury, the right to a public trial, the right to a speedy trial. All of these things were things that the Federalists were concerned about, and they insisted on a Bill of Rights before they would actually ratify the Constitution. Some states explicitly said, we will not ratify this without a Bill of Rights. So although the Anti-Federalists lost, so to speak, the Constitution was adopted, they had a very important influence on the Constitution by creating the Bill of Rights and creating this, explicit list of personal freedoms that are protected from the government. And in the slides after that, you see some discussion of Brutus, who was one of the most intelligent and articulate of the Anti-Federalists. There's a link to one of his essays. And he had, one of the things that's very interesting about him is, he said the Constitution will basically create one central government and abolish the states. Now that didn't actually happen. So that prediction was not quite correct. However, he said there's this clause in the Constitution called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And that clause says that Congress can pass any laws that it thinks are necessary and proper to carry out the official duties that it has been clearly given by the Constitution. So in other words, the Constitution says Congress passes laws, and it can pass any laws it thinks are necessary and proper to carry out this function or to carry out any function for the federal government. And Brutus said that is going to be used to expand the federal government. And he was right about that. We'll see when we talk about federalism. The Necessary and Proper Clause is also called the Elastic Clause because the idea is it can be stretched to justify almost any new law, almost any new expansion of power by the federal government. So Brutus had a little bit too pessimistic or fearful a view of the idea that the federal government would just abolish all the states and there would just be one federal government. Again, the Anti-Federalists believed that the state governments would do better at protecting people's rights. Again, we'll see it was sort of ironic. Everybody seemed to agree about this, but of course, actually in American history, the state governments ended up not being very good at that. The federal government, especially in the 20th century, has been much better at protecting people's rights than the individual states. But at the time, everybody thought so. Brutus was worried that the Constitution would create a federal government strong enough that it could abolish the state governments. Again, that obviously didn't happen. But he also thought that the Necessary and Proper Clause would be used to expand federal power, and he was right about that. It absolutely was. The federal government absolutely became more and more powerful as a result of that, the Necessary and Proper Clause and the way that it was interpreted by the Supreme Court and the way that it's been used by Congress. So